London, 1824. Snow fell softly over St. Catherine's Orphanage when Anne Thorne heard her name spoken aloud for the first time in years. Not by the children, not by the nuns, but by someone who should not even know she existed. Anne Thorne. The sound split the narrow corridor like a crack through ice. At 23, she knew every damp stain on those stone walls, every floorboard that groaned beneath her bare feet, every broken promise that lingered in the building's silence. But she had never heard her name spoken with authority, as if it carried weight, as if it meant something. She stopped by the fogged dormitory window and pressed her fingers against the frozen glass until her skin burned. Outside, elegant carriages glided along the snow-covered street, carrying people toward lives she would never have. People with surnames, with histories, with someone who claimed them as their own. Anne had never had any of that. To everyone inside those walls, she was merely the girl from the second floor, the one who looks after the younger children, invisible enough not to be a nuisance, useful enough not to be discarded. The door creaked behind her. Mrs. Hollis entered without knocking, as she always did. The lines on her face looked harsher than usual that morning. In one hand, she held a sealed envelope marked with red wax. The crest was impossible to miss, a crowned lion, emblem of a noble house. "There is a gentleman waiting for you in the receiving room," she said, her metallic tone betraying something unusual. "A duke." Anne turned slowly. The air caught in her lungs. A duke. For her. Her heart struck once, too hard, as if she had committed some grave mistake. Then it seemed to suspend itself, motionless in the thick white silence of the snow still falling beyond the window, because dukes did not enter orphanages by accident. And no one searched for a woman without a name, without a reason. If you too cherish period stories, those that whisper like old letters and echo like longing hearts, leave your like and subscribe to the Countess's Tales. Your support allows these narratives to cross oceans and reach more souls around the world. And before you go, tell me in the comments which city and country you're watching from. It's always enchanting to discover how far our stories travel. Anne Thorne did not know who her parents were. She knew only that she had been left on the steps of St. Catherine's on a winter night, wrapped in a coarse wool shawl, and in a promise whispered to no one at all, "I will come back for her." 23 years later, no one had returned. She grew up among abandoned children and severe nuns, learning to read from scripture and to embroider on scraps donated by charitable ladies who passed through the orphanage as one might fulfill a duty, never once meeting the eyes of the girls they claimed to help. At 16, she became an assistant. By 20, a substitute mother to the youngest. She had no dowry. She had no inheritance. She did not even have the certainty that anyone, anywhere, remembered her birth. Her only wealth was knowing how not to take up space, not to demand, not to expect. Anne descended the narrow staircase with measured steps, her heart beating at a rhythm that did not belong to the orphanage's silence. It was not hope. Hope was far too dangerous for women like her. This was something else, a premonition. The door to the receiving room stood ajar. She stepped inside. The man stood beside the nearly extinguished hearth, tall, unmoving, as though the miserable room itself had been forced to adjust to his presence. He appeared to be a little over 30, dark hair slicked back with severe discipline, blue eyes cold and far too observant. He wore an impeccable dark wool overcoat and had not even bothered to remove his leather gloves. He studied her for a moment that lasted too long. Then he spoke. "Miss Thorne, you do not belong in this place." The words fell into the room like something already decided. Anne felt the blood drain from her face. "You never have." Only then did he add, with the same cutting calm, "I am Alistair Harcourt, Duke of Emberley, and I have come for you." Chapter 1. The Weight of a Name. Anne did not move. She could not. The Duke's words still echoed through the small cold room, hanging in the air like the snow outside. Impossible. Unreal. Too heavy to be true. "I have come for you." Mrs. Hollis cleared her throat behind her, a harsh, impatient sound that cut through the silence like a blade. Anne stepped forward, her bare feet silent on the worn rug that smelled of mold and years of dampness. She kept her eyes lowered, as she had been taught since childhood. Dukes did not look at women like her. Dukes did not enter orphanages to retrieve forgotten, illegitimate daughters. "Your Grace," she murmured, her voice barely audible, rough from disuse. "There must be some mistake." "There is no mistake." The certainty in his voice was absolute, unyielding. Anne lifted her gaze slowly, as one might when fearing something dangerous. Alistair Harcourt's blue eyes studied her with an intensity that made her feel exposed, stripped bare, as though he could read every thought, every fear folded into the quiet layers of her soul. There was no kindness in that aristocratic face of hard lines and tense jaw, only cold, relentless determination. He took a step toward her, and Anne had to fight the instinct to retreat. "Your mother was Helen Thorne," he said, and Anne felt the world tilt, the ground vanish beneath her feet. Daughter of a textile merchant from Bristol. When she became pregnant, her family cast her out, cut all ties. For them, it was easier to pretend Helen had never existed. Anne clenched her fingers into her worn skirt, feeling the rough weave of cheap cotton beneath her palms. Helen. Her mother had a name, she had a city, she had a story, and a family that erased her, as if erasure were easier than love. "She worked briefly on an estate in Kent 24 years ago," Alistair continued, his voice controlled, every word measured. "In the summer of 1800. After that, she was alone. She died in childbirth here in London, in a boarding house near the Thames." The words fell like stones into still water, sending ripples that never settled. Anne closed her eyes for a moment, drawing in the cold air scented with burnt candle wax and old wood. It should not hurt. She should not allow herself to grieve someone she had never known, never held, never heard speak her name with tenderness. But it did, like an old wound that had never fully healed. "Then why—" she began, but Mrs. Hollis interrupted, her shrill voice shattering the moment. "Your Grace, surely you understand that the girl has no preparation whatsoever for life beyond these walls. She knows nothing of society. She has no refined education." "That does not concern me," Alistair cut in without taking his eyes off Anne, as though the matron did not exist. "She is her father's daughter, and that changes everything. Her father's daughter." Anne lifted her chin and, for the first time since entering the room, held his gaze without retreating. There was something in that statement, something unspoken, sharp as a blade he carried with care. "Who was my father?" she asked. And her own voice surprised her, steady, clear, alive. The silence that followed was thick, heavy as molten lead. Mrs. Hollis held her breath. Alistair remained still, only his jaw tightening slightly, his gloved fingers curling before slowly relaxing. "Your father," he said at last, each word placed as though final, "was Edmund Ravenshire, the Earl of Ravenshire." The ground vanished completely beneath Anne's feet. Her father, an earl. She was not merely a forgotten mistake, a discarded child, a tolerated shadow. The blood that ran through her veins, the same blood that had rendered her invisible for 23 years, was Ravenshire blood. "This is absurd," Mrs. Hollis burst out. "This girl has no proof—" "I have the will," Alistair interrupted, reaching into the inner pocket of his overcoat and withdrawing a folded document. The paper was thick, official, sealed with red wax. "Drafted 3 months before the Earl's death, legally registered in London and Kent." Anne could barely breathe. "Edmund Ravenshire left a substantial inheritance to Anne Thorne, daughter of Helen Thorne, born January 1801, he continued. "Income from a commercial property in Bristol, shares in 2 shipping companies, and an annual allowance of £1,200. £1,200. The number made no sense. It was more than Anne could earn in an entire lifetime of labour. It was not generosity. It was organised guilt, a belated attempt to compensate for a silence that had lasted 23 years. All placed in trust, Alistair added, structured so that no legitimate heir may contest it. Anne felt her legs weaken. "But there is a condition," he said, his tone becoming more formal, almost uncomfortable. The will requires a legal guardian until you reach the age of 25 or marry. Someone to administer the estate, protect your interests and prepare you to manage your fortune. Anne swallowed hard. And who? I am, Alistair replied simply. The Earl named me executor and legal guardian. It was not a request, it was a legal imposition. Refusal would mean defying a registered will. The word fell like ice. Imposition. I am an administrator before I am a duke, he added, his tone not arrogant, merely factual, and I do not allow estates to be squandered. Nor people. Anne tried to arrange the world inside her head. Why did he do this? She asked. Why now, when he never came? Because Edmund Ravenshire was a coward, Alistair said, and for the first time there was something almost human in his voice. He loved your mother but lacked the courage to defy society. He kept the secret, lived with the guilt, and in the end he could not die carrying it. He stepped closer. On his deathbed, he told me everything. Gave me the letters, the proof, and asked that I find you, that I ensure you received what was yours. A pause. And that you learned to live in the world he prevented you from knowing. Anne felt small and immense at once, rich and disposable, acknowledged and delayed, as though she had arrived too late to her own life. What do you expect of me? She asked, needing something solid. That you come with me to Emberley Hall, Alistair replied. That you accept the legal guardianship. That you learn to manage your inheritance. His gaze pierced her. And that you become the woman your father should have allowed you to be from the beginning. And if I refuse? He inclined his head. Then the inheritance will remain untouched until you turn 25. And until then, you will remain here. Anne looked down at her hands, cracked, red, hands that may never have belonged to her until now. I need time to think, she said, knowing it was a lie. She had already chosen. But women like her learned early that certainty could be mistaken for desperation. You have until dawn tomorrow, Alistair replied. Send word to the residents in Mayfair. He left without a farewell. Anne remained there, alone with Mrs. Hollis, with the cold, with the weight of a name she had never known belonged to her. Outside, the snow continued to fall. And inside the narrow room, Anne Thorne, daughter of the Earl of Ravenshire, heiress to a fortune she had never touched, tried to understand how someone could be worth so much and only begin to exist now. Chapter 2. The Weight of Duty. Alistair Harcourt did not sleep that night. Lying in the immaculate bed of the rented Mayfair residence, he watched shadows drift across the high ceiling while the fire in the hearth crackled softly, nearly spent. He was 31 years old and had long since lost count of how many nights he had endured like this, awake, imprisoned by decisions he could not undo, by promises that allowed no regret. But this night was different, because this time the promise was not merely moral, it was legal, registered, sealed, irrevocable. Edmund Ravenshire had named him guardian of Anne Thorne, not as a favour, but as an imposition written into a will. Alistair could not simply hand her the money and walk away. He could not delegate. The law bound him to her until she reached 25 or married, 2 years, or a marriage. Alistair closed his eyes, but Anne's image remained, far too vivid behind his lids. Honey-coloured eyes, too alert for someone who had learned to disappear. Hands marked by hard work. A contained posture, not submissive, but trained never to take up space. She did not resemble Edmund. Thank God. And yet there was something in the way she lifted her chin, in the steady way she had asked the impossible question, "Who was my father?" that reminded him dangerously of him, contained pride, dignity, without an audience. Edmund Ravenshire had been more of a father to Alistair than his own ever managed to be. Mentor, confidant, compass. The man who believed in him when the title still seemed impossibly distant. And who, on his deathbed, gripping Alistair's hand with desperate strength, confessed the secret he had carried for 23 years. There is a girl, my daughter. Helen died in childbirth. I left her at an orphanage. I did not have the courage. Edmund had wept, a grown man, a respected earl, crying like someone who had finally lost the right to postpone his reckoning. I left her an inheritance, protected. But she will need to learn how to live in this world. She needs someone I trust. Promise me, Alistair. And Alistair had promised, because Edmund had asked, because he owed him more than he could ever enumerate, because men like Alistair Harcourt did not choose which duties to fulfill. Still, Edmund had been dead for 2 months, and Alistair had taken 8 weeks to keep his promise. Estates, meetings, the House of Lords, pointless social dinners, everything seemed urgent until it no longer was. And in the meantime, Anne had been washing clothes in a freezing orphanage, unaware that a fortune waited for her in silent vaults. Alistair rose and went to the window. London slept beneath the snow, indifferent. How many broken promises had that city absorbed without flinching? This would not be one of them. Edmund had trusted him. And he would not fail, even if it meant teaching a young woman raised in an orphanage how to manage commercial assets, revenues and investments meant to sustain generations. The problem was not the task. The problem was what he had felt upon seeing her. Not pity, not exactly curiosity. Anne had not cried, had not begged, had not shrunk when the truth was revealed. She had simply listened, like someone accustomed to surviving blows far heavier than words. Alistair pressed his fingers against the frozen windowsill. He needed control. He always had. Control had kept him intact after his mother's death. Control had sustained him through his father's rigid upbringing. Control had made him a respected duke when he inherited the title at 28, after his brother's sudden death. And control would keep him distant from Anne Thorne. She was his legal ward, his responsibility. Men of honor did not confuse duty with inclination, even when inclination arrived disguised as curiosity. Morning came with fresh snow and a note delivered by a mud-splattered messenger. Alistair recognized the handwriting at once, large, careful letters from someone who had learned to write too late in life. He unfolded the paper and read, "I accept your guardianship, Anne Thorne." Nothing more. No gratitude, no emotion. Only direct acceptance, like someone who understood contracts because she could not afford to refuse them. Alistair folded the note slowly. That, he realized, was strength, not docility. An hour later he returned to St. Catherine's. Anne was waiting. She wore the same simple dress, but now had on worn boots and held a small cloth bundle. "Are you ready?" he asked. "Yes," she replied. "That is all I have." All. 23 years condensed into a bundle of fabric. In the courtyard a servant waited with a pair of new boots, plain, warm, appropriate. "For the journey," Alistair said. "I hope they fit." Anne hesitated before accepting them, not out of pride, but because she had learned early that nothing new truly belonged to her for long. She put them on with excessive care, as if the leather might vanish at the slightest misstep. "Thank you," she murmured. "They fit." During the journey, they sat on opposite sides of the carriage. The distance was proper, necessary. Anne watched the world through the window with quiet focus, not distracted. Assessing. Alistair noticed, and it unsettled him. "When we arrive at Emberley Hall," he said at last, "Mrs. Keating will attend to your immediate needs." Anne nodded. "But starting tomorrow, your training begins." "Training?" she asked, turning to him. "Administration," he explained. "Money without knowledge is risk. Your inheritance must be understood before it is used." "And your grace will teach me?" "I am your legal guardian. It is my duty." The word fell heavily between them. Anne turned back to the window. "I understand," she said simply. When the gates of Emberley Hall came into view, Anne caught her breath. "It is large," she murmured. "It is prosperous," Alistair corrected. "Well managed. Debt-free. Sustainable." He paused. "It was built that way, not inherited that way." She looked at the house with a different kind of attention. At the entrance, servants stood in line, watching. "Miss Thorne," Alistair said, now in his public tone, This is Mrs. Keating. The housekeeper assessed Anne with professional precision. Welcome. Anne nodded, gripping her bundle like an anchor. Tomorrow at 9, Alistair said. We will meet in the library. He turned to enter, then stopped. Anne, he said quietly, I know this is not easy, but you are no longer alone. She met his gaze for a brief moment. No, she replied. Now I am merely a legal obligation. And she went inside before he could respond. Alistair remained outside, the cold biting at his fingers. Obligation. It was true, but for the first time in many years, Alistair Harcourt realized that fulfilling his duty might not be enough. Chapter 3. The First Lesson. Anne did not sleep well on her first night. The room was far too large, larger than the entire dormitory at St. Catherine's combined. The canopied bed, the deep blue velvet coverlets, the fireplace kept steadily alight. Everything seemed designed for someone who knew how to take up space, someone accustomed to existing without asking permission. Anne was not that person. She spent hours seated in the armchair by the window, watching the snow-covered gardens beneath the pale moon, trying to understand how her life had changed in 48 hours. 2 days earlier, she had been invisible. Now, she was an heiress. 2 days earlier, she had no future beyond the next winter. Now she had £1,200 a year, a number too large to fit inside her understanding, and a guardian who saw her as a legal obligation. I am your legal guardian. It is my duty. The phrase echoed with uncomfortable precision. Anne tightened her fingers around the arm of the chair. She did not expect affection, nor kindness. She knew better than that. But perhaps humanity. A minimal recognition that she was not merely an administrative problem inherited from a dead man. She rebuked herself at once. Alistair Harcourt owed her nothing beyond what the law required. And she owed him everything: the roof, the food, the opportunity to touch a fortune her father, the father who had never had the courage to claim her, had left far too late. Cowardice. The word hurt, because it rang true. At precisely 9 o'clock, Anne descended to the library. Eliza helped her into one of the new dresses, dark green wool, simple in cut but proper. As she pinned her hair into a discreet knot, Anne lingered before the mirror. The woman reflected there looked capable, contained, almost respectable. But she felt like an imposter wearing another woman's skin. The library was vast, shelves from floor to ceiling, the scent of old paper and leather, a mahogany table occupying the center like a working altar. Alistair was already there, standing by the window, reading correspondence. No coat, white shirt, dark waistcoat, his black hair slightly undone, as if he had run a hand through it without thinking. He looked less like a duke this way, more like a man. He lifted his gaze. Punctual, he said. Not as praise, merely observation. Sit. Anne complied. Alistair took the seat opposite her, creating the proper distance between guardian and ward. He placed a neatly arranged stack of papers before her. Let us begin with the essential. Can you read? The question was practical. Still, Anne felt her cheeks burn. I can. I read well. Numbers? Enough. He nodded, making a note. Read this. Anne took the document. The handwriting was precise, cold. Each line seemed to contain a life that was not her own. She read and reread. Commercial property in Bristol, $400 a shipping shares, $500 fixed income in trust, $300 a total, $1,200 annually. £1,200 per year, Alistair said. For perspective, a family lives comfortably on 200. Anne lifted her gaze slowly. I don't know. How one uses this. You learn, he replied. That is what we will do here. The next hour passed in methodical explanation. Alistair spoke of revenues, contracts, risk. He did not spare her difficult terms. He did not oversimplify. He treated her as someone capable of understanding, and Anne realized how rare that was. She listened with fierce attention. She asked questions. Some hesitant, others too direct for someone without formal education. "This administrator in Bristol," she said, pointing to a report, "why is he paid a fixed commission rather than a percentage?" Alistair paused for a moment. "Because he was hired during a period of instability." "But now the income is stable," Anne observed. "Would it not be more advantageous to renegotiate?" The silence lasted only a second, but it was enough. "Yes," he replied, "it would." Something shifted, not a smile. Not explicit approval, but Alistair began to look at her differently, less cautiously, more evaluatively. "You learn quickly," he said, and this time there was genuine surprise. Anne felt a strange warmth in her chest. "Numbers do not judge," she said. "They simply tell the truth." "Exactly," he replied, "and that is why they frighten so many people." He leaned back in his chair. "Most aristocratic women are taught to avoid this, to appear ignorant as a virtue. I cannot afford that luxury," Anne said before she could stop herself. Alistair held her gaze. "No," he agreed, "and that makes you different. Different. Not a bastard. Not a mistake. Just different." "What do I do with that?" she asked, almost in a whisper. "Whatever you wish," Alistair said. "Your fortune gives you real independence, not symbolic. You may choose, invest, expand, support causes. You do not need to marry to survive." The idea felt absurd and dangerous. "And your grace," Anne hesitated. "You will teach me all of this?" "I am obliged to," he replied. The word fell cold again. "But I will teach you." "Obligation." Anne nodded. When she rose to leave, she stopped at the door. "May I ask something?" "Yes." "Why did he leave me all this, if he never had the courage to acknowledge me?" Alistair took longer to answer. "Because guilt is easier than facing the world for someone," he said at last. And it was all Edmund Ravenshaw was capable of offering. Anne absorbed that in silence. "Thank you," she said, not to him, for the truth. Later, alone in the too large bedchamber, Anne sat on the edge of the bed and drew a deep breath. Guilt had purchased her future, and she would learn to turn it into freedom, even if that meant spending 2 years as the legal obligation of a man who pretended indifference and who, without realizing it, was already beginning to watch her far too closely. In the library, Alistair remained seated far longer than he intended. The chair across from him was empty. "You learn quickly," he thought, and for the first time since accepting that promise, he felt something beyond duty, curiosity, silent, inconvenient, and dangerously alive. Chapter 4. The Unease of Admiration. Alistair had not expected her to be intelligent. He had expected obedience, gratitude, perhaps some resistance born of wounded pride. But not this. The way Anne absorbed information as if she were starving for it, the way she asked questions that went straight to the core of complex matters, the way she identified inconsistencies in contracts that many businessmen ignored out of convenience or habit. 3 weeks had passed since her arrival at Emberley Hall. 3 weeks of daily lessons in the library. 3 weeks of watching her transform from invisible into inevitable. Alistair closed the ledger he had been reviewing and rubbed his tired eyes. It was late, past midnight, but sleep would not come. It never did when his mind insisted on cataloguing things he had no business noticing, like the way Anne bit her lower lip when concentrating on difficult figures, the way her face lit up when she finally grasped a complex concept, not with arrogance, but with a genuine, almost childlike joy of discovery. The way, 3 days earlier, she had pointed out an issue in the Bristol storage contracts that Alistair himself had failed to notice. "This isn't right," she had said, her finger resting on the problematic line. "If the property is worth more now than it was 10 years ago, why has the rent remained the same?" And Alistair, who prided himself on managing Emberley Hall with impeccable efficiency, had been forced to admit, because the estate's solicitor was negligent or incompetent. Anne had looked at him with those honey-coloured eyes that seemed to pierce masks, not with defiance, but with something far more dangerous, quiet equality. "Then we should correct it. We." As if they were partners, as if she had the right to use the plural. And Alistair, instead of correcting her, had nodded. Yes? We should. Now, alone in his study at 2 in the morning, he tried to understand exactly when Anne Thorne had ceased to be a legal obligation and become something more complicated. It was not attraction. It could not be. She was 23, his legal ward, entirely dependent on him. Any feeling beyond professional duty would be an abuse of power. It would be repeating Edmund's error, using another's vulnerability for one's own satisfaction. And yet, why could he not stop noticing? The way she descended the stairs every morning, punctual at 9, always in simple but immaculate dresses, her hair pinned with a severity that inexplicably highlighted the delicacy of her face. The way she listened when he explained financial concepts, her head tilted slightly to the side, as if every word were something to be stored away. The way the day before she had laughed for the first time, a brief surprised sound, when he made a dry remark about the chronic incompetence of certain London bankers. That laugh had changed everything. Her face, the room, something in him. Alistair poured himself a glass of brandy. Drank it. It did not help. The problem was not Anne. The problem was him, because he was beginning to anticipate 9 o'clock in the morning as if it were the most interesting moment of the day. Because he found himself preparing clearer, more careful explanations, almost as if he wished to impress her. Because for the first time in years, Emberley Hall no longer felt merely functional, it felt inhabited. And that was dangerous. The following morning, Alistair entered the library determined to restore the proper distance. Anne was already there, seated at the table, reviewing the documents he had left for her to study. She wore a light brown dress, practical and discreet. She did not look up when he entered, too focused on her reading. "Good morning," Alistair said, keeping his tone professional. "Good morning, Your Grace," she replied without lifting her gaze. "I found something odd in the East India Company share reports." Of course she had. Alistair approached, maintaining a careful distance, and looked over her shoulder at the document. "What is it?" Anne pointed to a column of figures. "Dividends fell 8% last quarter, but the report does not explain why. It simply records the lower amount as if it were normal." Alistair frowned, pulled a chair closer, and sat beside her to see better. Too close. Not by intention, but close enough for him to notice the quiet warmth of her arm through the fabric of her dress, close enough for the silence between them to grow too dense to ignore. "You're right," he said, tracing the figures with his finger. "There was a fluctuation, likely ship losses or delays in trade routes, but it should be explained." "Then how do I discover the reason?" Anne asked, turning her face toward him. She was too close. Alistair could see faint golden flecks in her honey-colored eyes. He could catch the light scent of lavender, simple, clean, almost domestic. He moved away at once. "By writing to the company and requesting clarification," he said, standing and restoring the safe distance he should have maintained from the start. "It is your right as a shareholder. May I do that?" Anne looked genuinely surprised. "You not only may," Alistair replied, "you must. Money without oversight is money wasted." He walked toward the window, needing space. "Companies rely on the ignorance of their shareholders, especially women." "But I understand," Anne said. There was no pride in her voice. There was something new, emerging confidence. "Yes," he agreed without turning around. "You do." The silence that followed was different, not awkward, charged. "Your Grace?" Anne spoke at last. "May I ask a personal question?" Alistair turned carefully. "That depends on the question." "Why do you do this?" she asked, her eyes fixed on him. "Not merely fulfill the guardianship legally, but truly teach me. You could keep the money in trust and simply ignore me until I turn 25. It was a fair question, and a dangerous one, not because it demanded emotion, but because it forced him to look at something he preferred to keep unspoken. Alistair had no ready answer, only the uncomfortable certainty that fulfilling this guardianship had required more attention than it should have, more presence, more care. Things he did not analyze, did not question. He simply did them, as he did everything he considered duty. So he answered only, Because I promised Edmund I would prepare you, and I keep my promises. It was the correct answer, sufficient. It closed the matter without leaving room for interpretation. Anne nodded, returning her gaze to the papers before her. Of course, she said, duty. The word held no irony, no bitterness. It came as observation, as something learned too early. Alistair opened his mouth to say something, anything that would not sound so final, but she interrupted him first. Shall we continue the lesson? She asked, already resuming her professional tone. I would like to learn how to draft the letter to the company. There was a brief hesitation, not emotional, practical. Then he nodded. Yes, of course. They worked for another hour in focused silence. He dictated. She wrote, both remaining strictly within what was safe, measurable, neutral. Still, when Anne left the library, Alistair realized the room felt larger than before, empty in a way that was difficult to explain, not because something had been said, but because something was no longer possible. That afternoon he retreated to his study and summoned Mrs. Keating. Miss Thorne is adapting well? He asked, in the same tone he used for administrative matters. The servants treat her appropriately. Yes, Your Grace. She is discreet, polite, the housekeeper replied. She paused, brief, measured. But she spends a great deal of time alone. Alistair inclined his head slightly, as one recording a relevant fact. Perhaps it would be prudent to integrate her gradually, he said. A simple tea. Meeting the neighbours. Mrs. Keating held his gaze for a moment. And present her as what exactly? He exhaled slowly. I do not yet know. If I may, Your Grace, she continued carefully, Miss Thorne does not require introductions just now. She requires direction. Administration? He asked automatically. Purpose, the housekeeper corrected. For the first time, someone is preparing her to exist beyond survival. At this moment, that matters more than any drawing room. Alistair did not respond at once, not because he disagreed, but because he understood the weight of the statement, and understanding made everything far more complicated than he cared to admit. That evening, Alistair dined alone as he always did. Anne ate in her rooms as was appropriate for a ward, but the dining room felt larger, more empty, and for the first time in many years, Alistair Harcourt understood that solitude was not the same as control. It was simply solitude. And perhaps, just perhaps, teaching Anne Thorne not to need anyone was the cruelest way to discover that he himself was beginning to need her, which was entirely unacceptable and entirely inevitable. Chapter 5. The Silent Bond. Anne discovered that she liked numbers because they did not lie. 5 weeks at Emberley Hall, 5 weeks of daily lessons that began at 9 in the morning and ended when Alistair decided she had absorbed enough information for one day. 5 weeks learning that money was not something distant or abstract. It was a tool, a choice, a quiet power accumulated over time. And 5 weeks observing the man who taught her. Anne did not want to observe him. She should not. From the very first day he had been clear. She was a legal obligation, a duty imposed by a will, nothing more. And yet, it had become impossible not to notice. The way he explained difficult concepts without ever making her feel small. The way his blue eyes sharpened when she asked a precise question. The way he sometimes forgot the formal distance and sat beside her to examine documents, close enough that Anne could feel the subtle warmth of his presence, the faint scent of leather and cologne, and how, almost always, he realized the closeness too late, pulling away with controlled abruptness, as though his own body had crossed an invisible boundary. It confused her. Alistair treated her with impeccable correctness. He never touched her beyond what was necessary. Never made personal remarks. Yet there were moments, too brief to confront, too intense to ignore, when Anne caught him watching her with an expression she could not name. It was not desire. It was not pity. It was conflict, as though admiring her were an error committed against his own will. That morning, Anne descended to the library at precisely 9, carrying the notebook in which she recorded everything. Concepts, figures, ideas. It had become a precious object, Concrete proof that she was not merely occupying space in that house. She was learning how to exist within it. Alistair was already there, but not in his usual position by the window. He was seated at the table, surrounded by letters and reports, his shoulders tense, his jaw set. "Good morning," Anne said, hesitant. He looked up. There was weariness there. Not ordinary physical fatigue, but something deeper. Concern. "Good morning," he replied. "Sit." "We have a problem." Anne's stomach tightened. "A problem?" Alistair slid a letter toward her. "From the administrator of the Bristol property. There is a dispute with the primary tenant. He refuses to accept the rent increase and threatens to take the matter to court. He claims the original contract guarantees him indefinite renewal without adjustment." Anne read quickly. The tone was defensive, almost aggressive. "But we identified that clause as problematic," she said. "We had an addendum drafted." "Which he refused to sign," Alistair replied, running a hand through his hair. "Without the signature, the original clause prevails." Anne drew a steady breath and reread the document, her mind already calculating. How much does he currently pay? £200 annually. And how much should he pay? About 350, given the market. How long has he occupied the warehouse? Alistair consulted another paper. 12 years. Anne did the calculation almost without noticing. Then he has saved nearly £1,800 by paying below fair value. Exactly, Alistair said, now watching her with full attention. Anne fell silent for a few seconds. He depends on the warehouse for his business? Yes, textile imports. Then we cannot treat him solely as an adversary, she said slowly. We must offer him something he values. Alistair leaned forward. Such as? Anne tapped the contract. Stability. The current contract is annual. He lives under constant uncertainty. If we offer a 5-year contract with adjusted rent, fixed for that period, he gains security. We gain fair income. The silence that followed was dense. Alistair stared at her as if seeing something new, something that had always been there, now finally revealed. Then he smiled, not the social smile, not the polite one, but a slow, genuine smile, heavy with recognition. That is brilliant, he said. It is not only logical, it is strategic. Anne felt her face warm. It is simply seeing both sides. It is more than that, he corrected. It is leadership. He spoke her name then, too low to be necessary, too intimate to be casual. Anne. The sound made her heart falter. Thank you, she murmured. Their fingers drew close when they both reached for the same document. They did not touch, but the simultaneous withdrawal was too swift to be coincidence. The air shifted. Alistair was the first to break the moment. I will draft the proposal today, he said, already reclaiming his professional tone. And you will learn how to do this as well, drafting contracts, negotiating terms. Your Grace will teach me? Yes, he replied, not looking at her. It is part of the guardianship. Guardianship. The word fell between them like a door closing. Anne opened her notebook, but before she could write, she heard him speak again. Anne. She looked up. So you do not need to thank me, he said, his voice strangely tight. Not for this, not for anything. It is a legal obligation, but it is also the minimum Edmund should have done. You are not required to care, she said carefully, only to manage the money. Alistair finally held her gaze, and there was something there Anne had not expected to find. Not duty, not coldness. Care. Perhaps, he said after a brief pause, I have been less distant than I intended. The sentence was not spoken as a confession, nor as justification. It sounded almost like a technical observation, something noted too late. The silence stretched. Anne kept her hands still on the notebook, as if any movement might shatter something too fragile to define. She did not know how to respond. She did not even know if there was anything to respond to. Before the silence demanded more than either of them was willing to give, Alistair rose. Rest today, he said, already returning to his controlled tone. Tomorrow we will begin lessons on drafting contracts. He created distance as he spoke, confirmed it as he left. Anne remained seated, the notebook forgotten in her lap, her heart beating far too fast for someone who had heard so little. Less distant. She did not know exactly what it meant, but she knew it was not irrelevant. And for the first time in her life, she perceived something with unsettling clarity. She was no longer being tolerated or administered or merely protected. She was being considered, which made everything more complex and far more difficult to ignore. Chapter 6. The Inner Conflict. Alistair Harcourt made a mistake. Not a legal mistake, not a financial one. Those he avoided with near surgical precision. This mistake was different, subtler. And for that very reason far more dangerous. He had realized he no longer kept the distance he believed necessary. It had not been a decision, not an impulse. It had been a quiet accumulation, small concessions, longer pauses, explanations that stretched beyond what was required, less distant than I intended. Since then, the control that had always anchored him had begun to show discreet fissures, almost imperceptible to anyone but himself. Enough time had passed since Anne's arrival at Emberley Hall for the house to stop feeling temporary. Routines had settled. Mornings had a rhythm, lessons, a constancy. Everything functioned as it should, except him. He tried to re-establish boundaries, kept the lessons strictly objective, avoided any remark that was not indispensable, measured each gesture, each glance, not out of social prudence, but out of internal necessity. None of it worked. Because Anne had learned to read numbers, and without meaning to, she had learned to read him. She noticed when he hesitated before sitting, when he ended an explanation too early, when he looked away too quickly, and when the library each morning seemed charged with something unspoken, not discomfort, but contained tension, as though the air itself waited for a decision neither of them dared to form. And there was something even more unsettling. She had improved. Not only in competence, but in presence. That very week, while reviewing reports from the British Mercantile Company, Anne had spotted a discrepancy it once took Alistair days to detect when managing his investments alone. And Alistair understood, with uncomfortable clarity, that the problem was no longer teaching her. It was that he had begun to watch her, not as a ward, not as a responsibility, but as someone whose attention had become inevitable. The confirmation came days later, during the review of the British Mercantile Company reports. "This figure doesn't match the previous one," Anne had said, calmly indicating the column of numbers. "Either there is a miscalculation, or someone is diverting dividends." Alistair leaned over the page, certain he would find a simple error. He did not. She was right. He spent the rest of the afternoon drafting severe letters, demanding a full audit. He prevented a considerable loss. He knew that. But the unease did not come from the money preserved. It came from the fact that he had trusted her without hesitation. When he finally thanked her, he did so in the same neutral tone he used with experienced administrators. Anne had merely smiled. No vanity, no expectation, like someone for whom competence did not need to be celebrated. "You taught me well, Your Grace," she had said. The smile asked for nothing, and yet it stayed with him, longer than it should have. Now alone in his study after dinner, Alistair faced the truth he had been avoiding for weeks. What he felt for Anne Thorne no longer fit inside the word duty. It was admiration, respect, and something more dangerous, quieter, an attraction he refused to name. She was 23, he was 31. 8 years would not be scandal in other circumstances, but circumstances were everything. He was her legal guardian. He managed her money. He held real power over her future. Any step beyond the line would be an abuse. It would be repeating Edmund Ravenshire's error, confusing authority with desire, vulnerability with entitlement. And Alistair had grown up swearing he would never become that kind of man. A knock at the door cut through his thoughts. "Come in." Mrs. Keating entered with evening correspondence. "Letters from London, Your Grace. One from Viscount Ashby." Alistair took the envelope with displeasure. Ashby never wrote without reason, and the reason almost always involved improper curiosity. He read the letter, his brow tightened. "Is there a problem?" the housekeeper asked. "Lady Catherine Hollister is planning a dinner next week," he said, his voice tense, "and she strongly suggests that I bring Miss Thorne." Mrs. Keating stiffened. She already knows of the young lady's existence. "The entire county does," he replied bitterly. "Servants talk, neighbours watch. It is impossible to hide a woman living at Emberley Hall for so long. And do you intend to accept?" Alistair fell silent. Refusing would be a direct insult to the most influential woman in the region. Accepting would expose Anne to cruel judgment before she was ready, before he was ready to watch her be judged. "I don't know," he admitted. Mrs. Keating inclined her head. "You have prepared her well. Perhaps it is time to trust that." He looked up, unsettled. "Preparing and protecting are not the same?" "No," she answered calmly. "Preparing is giving tools. Overprotecting is keeping someone dependent." The truth stung because it was precise. But there was another reason, harder to admit, for delaying any social introduction. One Alistair refused to name. He did not want to see her watched, assessed, courted. Anne, with fortune and intelligence, would be desired. And the thought of watching her leave, of seeing her choose another, stirred something that felt dangerously like jealousy, ridiculous, unacceptable, too human. "I will reply tomorrow," he said, ending the matter. The next morning Anne entered the library and immediately sensed something was different. Alistair stood by the window, unmoving, staring at the frost-covered gardens as though he did not see them. "Good morning," she said cautiously. He turned. Conflict lived in his blue eyes. "Good morning, sit. We must speak." She obeyed, her stomach tightening. "We have received an invitation," he said. "Lady Catherine Hollister requests your presence at a dinner." "Requests or demands?" Anne asked. A brief smile without humour. "With Lady Catherine there is no distinction." "And your Grace, will you accept?" He folded his arms. "I wanted to hear from you." Her surprise was genuine. "My opinion?" "You will be the target of judgment," he replied. "You decide." Anne thought for a few moments. "I will be judged either way," she said at last. "But now I know who I am, not by the name they gave me, but by what I build. I know my worth." She rose, steady. "Accept the invitation." "I will go." Something shifted in him, not relief, but deep recognition. "You are brave," he murmured, "or simply tired of being afraid." He took a step toward her, stopped, fought himself. "Anne," he said, his voice low, "at the dinner, I will not be able to defend you openly. Distance is expected between guardian and ward." "I understand," she replied, even though it hurt. "I will be alone." "No," he said, moving closer than he should have. "You never will be." He touched her shoulder. A brief chaste gesture, and yet heavy with intention. "Even if I am not at your side, you have me." Anne felt the world suspend itself. "Alistair," she whispered. His name, without title, without shield. He froze. The sound struck him like naked truth. He stepped back at once. "Forgive me," he said, composing himself. "That was inappropriate." "It was not," she replied, steady. "It was human." He held her gaze for a moment too long, then turned away. "I will accept the invitation. Mrs. Keating will see to what is necessary. The dinner is in 6 days." "Yes, Your Grace." But something had changed. He had touched her. He had said she was not alone. He had let the conflict slip through the control he tried to maintain. And Anne, who had learned to read numbers, was now learning to read men. And she saw something dangerous there, something that could become love or ruin. Perhaps both. Chapter 7. The Awareness of Love. Anne spent the 6 days leading up to the dinner preparing as one prepares for a silent battle. Mrs. Keating conducted the etiquette lessons with implacable precision, the exact angle of the head in a curtsy, the proper rhythm for lifting a teacup to one's lips, the art of replying without revealing. and of remaining silent without appearing submissive. Eliza assisted with the choice of dress. Silk in a soft bronze hue, discreet enough not to provoke, elegant enough to forbid disdain. None of it, however, prepared her for what truly unsettled her. Since that morning in the library, the brief touch to her shoulder, the low-spoken words, "You have me, always," something had shifted within her. Not loudly, not dramatically. But Anne, who had never been a priority in anyone's thoughts, felt something give way inside, and she understood with a clarity that terrified her. She was falling in love with Alistair Harcourt, not with the title, not with the protection, but with the man who taught with genuine patience, who respected her intelligence, who visibly struggled against something he dared not name. And that was dangerous. He was her guardian. He held authority over her inheritance, her immediate future. Any feeling could be mistaken for gratitude, dependence, projection, except it did not feel like that. It felt like choice, like recognition, like love taking root where it should not exist. On the night of the dinner, Anne descended the stairs with her heart beating out of rhythm. Alistair waited in the entrance hall. The dark evening coat fit him perfectly, but that was not what held her attention. It was his gaze, too contained to be neutral, too intent to be merely polite, a look that lingered 1 second longer than propriety allowed before he composed himself. The bronze silk dress followed her silhouette with deliberate restraint. No excess, no plea for permission. Her pinned hair left her face exposed, steady, serene. There was something there she had not learned at Emberley Hall. Presence. Alistair felt the impact before he formed the thought, and it angered him, because his first reaction had not been rational. It had been immediate, physical. God. He reined himself in just in time. "You are appropriate," he said, the word controlled enough to betray the effort it took to choose it. Appropriate was a convenient lie. She was striking, and he knew it. "Thank you," Anne replied, unaware of the full measure of what she had provoked. He offered his arm. The gesture was formal, expected, and yet, when she took it, the firm contact beneath the glove sent something vibrating, within her and within him. A silent warning that the evening would demand far more self-control than he had anticipated. "Remember," he murmured, for her alone, inclining himself only as much as necessary, "you owe no explanations to anyone. You are a legitimate heiress. Conduct yourself as such." But as they moved toward the door, Alistair felt an unsettling certainty take hold. Anne would not be the only one under scrutiny that night, and maintaining control would be far more difficult than it had seemed that morning. The Hollister mansion received them with excessive light and calculated smiles. Lady Catherine advanced at once, her eyes assessing Anne as one might inspect a rare object, not to admire it, but to determine its worth. "So this is Miss Thorne. Interesting." Interesting. The word carried enough judgment to wound. Anne performed a flawless curtsy. "Lady Catherine, thank you for the invitation." The hostess's smile widened, too satisfied. "It is always fascinating to encounter uncommon histories." Alistair remained motionless at Anne's side. She felt his tension, and knew that she was, in truth, alone. During dinner, questions arrived like blades wrapped in velvet. "And where did you reside before Emberley Hall?" "In London." "Which part of London?" Anne held the silence for a full second before answering. "At St. Catherine's Orphanage." The pause that followed was nearly theatrical. Lady Catherine laughed softly. "Extraordinary, and now under the protection of a duke. What a remarkable ascent." It was Alistair who cut through the air. "Miss Thorne is the acknowledged heiress of the Earl of Ravenshire. She is under my guardianship to learn the management of her fortune, nothing more." The tone admitted no rebuttal, but the damage had already been done. Anne felt indignation rise, not for herself, for him. "In fact, Lady Catherine," she said calmly, "I have learned far beyond the basics. I can read contracts, identify abusive clauses, question irregular revenues. I know how to protect what is mine." There were murmurs, discomfort, surprise. Some guests looked away. Others developed sudden interest in the plates before them. Lady Catherine maintained her smile long enough to avoid appearing defeated, but the glint in her eyes betrayed contained irritation. Conversation resumed with artificial care, too delicate, like cracked porcelain. After that, each dance felt like an inspection, each smile a test. Anne answered when addressed, danced when invited, smiled at the appropriate moments, but she felt the looks, evaluating, recalculating, revising internal narratives. It was no longer mere curiosity. It was reluctant recognition. She had not emerged unscathed, but she had emerged whole. Alistair remained irreproachable throughout the evening. He conversed, observed protocol, guided her with the precise distance society demanded. Still, each time their eyes met, there was something new there, not tension but silent alignment, as though, without planning it, they had crossed the same battlefield. When they finally left the Hollister mansion, the cold night air felt like release. In the carriage home, the silence lasted longer than comfort allowed, not from awkwardness, but from an excess of unspoken things. "I was inconvenient," Anne said without apology. "You were truthful," he replied. His voice was different, lower, more careful. That tends to unsettle those who live by appearances, she felt when he moved, not abruptly, not impulsively. Alistair sat beside her as one who accepts a decision, not as one who loses control. "Anne," he began, then stopped, drew a steady breath. "Teaching you ceased to be merely an obligation some time ago." Her heart pounded, but she did not look away. "Then what is it?" she asked. Alistair took his time answering. When he spoke, he chose each word as though stepping onto unstable ground. "It is realizing that I anticipate 9 o'clock in the morning more than I should." A brief pause. "It is noticing when you grasp something before I do. It is no longer being able to pretend this is only duty." He turned to her. "That does not mean promises, nor safety, nor an easy path." Another pause. "But I needed you to know." The truth of it passed through her completely, without relief, without fear, only clarity. "I feel the same," she said. That was when he kissed her. There was no urgency, no loss of control. It was a conscious act, firm, restrained, chosen. A kiss that promised no salvation, but made it impossible to pretend that nothing had changed. When they parted, the air seemed thinner, as if something invisible had shifted between them. "What do we do now?" Anne asked softly, without disguised expectation. Alistair rested his forehead against hers for a brief moment, too brief to be comfort, too long to be chance. "Now," he said, opening his eyes, "we do what we have always done best." He met her gaze. "We act with honor, even if it costs us." Anne nodded, and she knew with a clarity that did not frighten her. This was not yet declared love. It was something more dangerous. It was the point of no return. Chapter 8. The Definitive Gesture. Alistair Harcourt spent the entire night awake, reliving the kiss as though it were a sentence passed upon him. He should not have kissed her, not because the kiss had been weak, quite the opposite. The problem lay precisely in what it revealed, that beneath the mask of duty there lived a man capable of desire, of choice, of misstep, a man who, for a fraction of a second, had forgotten the word that had governed his life since youth: control. Anne was his legal ward. And that made his feelings a moral risk before they were ever a social scandal. He rose before dawn and dressed with automatic movements. The house still slept. The corridors felt too long, too empty, as if the walls themselves sensed that something had shifted and waited for consequence. In his study, he sat before the desk and stared into nothingness. The fire burned low. The same flame that once warmed his calculations now illuminated only the impasse. How does one desire someone over whom the law has granted power? The question demanded no answer. It merely exposed the danger, not of the feeling itself, but of the position that made innocence impossible. For no matter how Anne might say she chose him, the world would not believe it. Worse still, part of him would never believe it with full peace. There would always be a dark corner of conscience asking whether her feeling had been born of freedom or of need. At 8 o'clock, He sent a messenger to London with urgent instructions. At 9, as every day, Anne entered the library. She was pale, not with fear but with caution. There was in her expression the careful restraint of someone holding something fragile, afraid it might dissolve at a word, as if the night before could be undone by a sentence. "Good morning," she said, her voice softer than usual. Alistair stood. "Good morning." He gestured to the chair. Anne sat slowly, her fingers clenched in her lap. "If you are going to say that last night was a mistake," she began, almost breathless. "It was not." The words escaped too quickly, more honest than he intended. He drew a breath, searching for steadiness. "It was real, but it cannot remain disordered." Anne lifted her chin. "Brave. Always." "Disordered how?" Alistair reached for a leather folder and opened it, not to intimidate but to shield himself. Papers, when properly wielded, were the only armor the world respected. "While I am your guardian, any feeling between us will be treated as suspect. It does not matter what you feel. It does not matter what I feel. They will say I used my position. They will say you had no choice." He met her gaze steadily. "I will not allow them to reduce you to that." The silence that followed was heavy and intimate. "I had a choice," she said, her voice trembling slightly, as though defending her very existence. "I still do. I know." And there lay the pain. He believed her. The world would not. "But I need there to be not even the shadow of doubt, not for the county, and not for you, when you are alone at night." Anne drew a deep breath, as one steels the heart for a difficult answer. "What do you intend to do?" Alistair waited a full second before replying. Then he spoke with the same cool precision he used in serious negotiations, not from lack of feeling, but because the decision could not be allowed to shake. "I will relinquish my power over your inheritance, in practice, immediately." Anne blinked, confused. "But the will names me guardian until you are 25 or married. That does not change." He raised a document. "But the law allows for power of attorney, co-administration, independent oversight. It allows me to fulfill the role without holding control." She rose slowly. "You are saying you will give me everything?" Alistair walked to the window, his hands clasped behind his back. When he spoke again, his voice was lower, more human. "I am saying I will make you free enough to choose me without the world, or you yourself being able to call it disguised gratitude." Anne stepped closer, stopped a few paces away. "And if I say that perhaps—" She inhaled. "Perhaps this is already love." The word hung between them, fragile and far too dangerous to touch. Alistair closed his eyes for a moment, as if restraining something before it crossed an irreversible line. When he met her gaze again, there was no refusal, only too much care to allow illusion. "Then you must know," he said quietly, "that such a feeling can exist only if it is free of every shadow. Even mine." He stepped back as though his body knew before reason. "When the ground beneath your feet no longer depends on me," he continued, "when every decision, every choice, every risk is entirely yours, then what you feel cannot be mistaken for gratitude, necessity, or circumstance." A short, painful pause. "I have summoned my solicitor. He arrives today. In 3 weeks the documents will be ready. From that point on, you will manage everything, decide everything." "Sign everything?" His voice faltered almost imperceptibly. "I will no longer be the center of your financial future." The words were honor, and for that very reason, they hurt. Anne raised her hand and touched his face with a gentleness that stripped him of defenses. "You are setting me free, so that you may ask for me, not so that you may claim me." His chest tightened. "Exactly." And then, as if her body refused to let it remain only reason, Anne rose onto her toes and kissed him, a brief, chaste, deliberate kiss, a small and fierce vow. "Then I will choose you," she whispered, "and it will be the freest choice I have ever made." He stood motionless for a second, as though he needed to memorize the words to survive the months ahead. When the solicitor arrived, the afternoon light had already turned pale and cold against the tall windows. Blackstone was a middle-aged man with a dry voice and eyes trained to suspect intention. He sat before Alistair and barely glanced at Anne, until he realized she was there by her own choice, not as ornament. "Your Grace wishes to transfer effective control to a woman of 23? He asked bluntly. "Guardianship exists to prevent precisely that." Alistair did not bristle. "Miss Thorne is not precisely that." Anne did not look away. Blackstone leafed through reports, letters, contracts, searching for weakness. "She renegotiated Bristol?" he asked at last, restrained surprise in his tone. "She did," Alistair said, and the word carried pride he no longer concealed. "She prevented our annual income from being drained by an indecent clause, and she identified a dividend discrepancy before it became theft." The solicitor lifted his eyes slowly, looked at Anne, then at Alistair. "I see," he said finally. "You are emotionally compromised." Alistair did not deny it, did not justify it. He simply said with almost brutal simplicity, "Yes, which is why I must remove from myself any power that could stain her name. I want everything that follows to be her choice." Blackstone drew a slow breath as if witnessing something rare. "In 3 weeks, I can structure irrevocable power of attorney, independent administration, and external oversight. It will be uncommon, but defensible." He turned to Anne. "And you understand the weight of this?" "I do," she replied, "and I accept it." 3 weeks later, the documents arrived. Irrevocable power of attorney, independent administrator, effective control in the hands of Anne Thorne. Alistair placed the papers before her in the library, the same room where she had learned that numbers could tell truth, and where he had learned that honor could wound. Anne signed with a steady hand. Alistair signed as witness. And in that instant, he felt something that was not loss. It was relief. "Done," he said, carefully filing the papers away. "You are free. Financially. Legally." Anne looked up. "And now?" Alistair waited a second before answering. The answer was the price. It was the right thing. "Now you live 6 months as absolute owner of yourself, without my shadow over your decisions." His voice wavered almost imperceptibly. "And when that time has passed, if you still want me, I will ask for your hand. Properly, without duty, without guardianship, without doubt." Anne nodded, tears shining in her eyes. 6 months, she repeated, tasting the word. Alistair extended his hand, not to touch, merely to offer presence. "I will wait," he said, "because you are worth the time, and because I would rather suffer with honor than gain you through anything that resembles power." Anne took his hand for a moment, firm, brief, and released it. And that same late afternoon, as Alistair left the library, Mrs. Keating waited in the corridor, her face tense. "Your Grace, a letter has arrived." The seal bore Lady Catherine Hollister's crest. Alistair broke the wax. He read only the first line and felt his stomach drop, because the county would not wait 6 months, and the world, hungry for scandal, had just caught the scent of blood. Chapter 9. The Final Choice. 3 months had passed since Anne signed the documents that made her financially independent. And the county did exactly what Alistair feared. Lady Catherine's letter was not a warning. It was a social sentence written in elegant ink, invitations that were mislaid, visits abruptly cancelled, smiles that turned away in church corridors. And as if that were not enough, a rumour began to circulate with the cruel ease of things accepted without proof. The Duke had purchased her devotion with her inheritance. Anne heard it once, twice, 3 times. And she decided no one would write her story for her. 6 months since the kiss in the carriage. 7 months since she arrived at Emberley Hall as a silent ward, carrying only a forgotten name and an inheritance she did not know how to use. Now, she was no one's ward. Anne woke that morning with a clarity she had never possessed before. She managed her inheritance alone, an estate now yielding £1,400 a year. She had increased it by 200 through merit of her own. She had renegotiated contracts, rejected poor terms, detected fraud seasoned men had ignored. She did not need anyone, and precisely because of that, she could choose. But choosing, too, was dangerous, because when a woman becomes free, the world rushes to call her ungrateful or bought. And Anne knew it. If she said yes to Alistair, they would call it dependence. If she said no, they would call it ambition. Either way, they would try to reduce her. There was only one way out. Simple, brutal, choose anyway. She walked to the window. The gardens of Emberley Hall were filled with late summer colour, alive, mature, so different from the hostile white landscape she had found upon her arrival. It was impossible not to notice the parallel. The last months had been strangely beautiful. Alistair had kept his promise. He maintained distance, no needless touch, no ambiguous words, no pressure. But there was respect, deep and constant. He consulted her on estate decisions. They dined together as equals. They debated politics, philosophy, administration. They disagreed at times. They laughed at others. And Anne realized something essential. She loved him more like this. Not as a savior, not as a guardian, but as a man who saw her and treated her as a partner. A knock at the door pulled her back into the present. "Come in." Helen entered with a tea tray and a sealed envelope. "From the Duke, miss." He asked that it be delivered this morning. Anne recognized the handwriting before she broke the seal. She read in silence. "Anne, 3 months have passed. You have proven, to yourself and to the world, that you need no guardian, protector, or savior. For that reason and that reason alone, I allow myself to ask, will you dine with me tonight? Not as a ward, not as an heiress under my supervision, but as the woman I wish to court, properly and with clear intentions. If you accept, I will be in the library at 7. If you refuse, I will respect your decision and never mention it again. The choice is entirely yours." Alistair Anne folded the letter carefully. He did not demand, he did not presume, he did not press, and she, who had never possessed true choices, now held the most important one. She spent the day in quiet reflection, not in doubt, only in recognition. She revisited every moment of the last 7 months, the lessons, the debates, the difficult silences, the decisions in which he chose what was right, even when it cost him. She loved that man, not because he had rescued her, but because he had freed her. At 7 o'clock, Anne went down to the library. The room had been transformed. Candles cast golden light over the shelves. A smaller table, intimate, had been set for 2. White lilies scented the air, discreet, elegant, exactly like her. Alistair waited by the window. When he turned and saw her, he did not try to hide his nerves. There was no duke in that moment, only a man waiting for an answer. "You came," he said. For a second, Anne saw the man behind the duke, the man who had learned to survive by asking nothing of anyone, and who now stood there waiting to be chosen. And she understood, with a clarity that ached. His fear was not of scandal, it was of deserving, and still losing. "I did," Anne replied, moving closer. "Did you think I wouldn't?" "I was afraid," he confessed. "Afraid that now you are free you would realize you don't need me." Anne touched his face. "I don't," she said, calm as truth. "And that is exactly why I choose you." He closed his eyes, as if the words held him upright. "Are you certain?" he asked softly. "Because if I say what I want to say, the world will not be kind." "It never has been," Anne answered. "But I survived being invisible." "I am not afraid of being judged." Alistair took her hands. "Anne Thorne, you entered this house as a legal obligation and became the person I admire most in the world." He drew a breath. "You are my equal, my partner." A short pause, because another word might have been too much risk. "And I love you." He knelt before her, not as theatre, as a conscious choice. "Will you marry me, not out of duty, not out of gratitude, but because I want to spend my life at your side and honor every decision you make within it?" Anne did not hesitate. "Yes," she said, "I choose you." And as she spoke it, Anne understood that her yes was not surrender. It was victory. He kissed her then, not with urgency but with certainty, with promise. Later, seated at the table, they spoke of the future, of the announcement, of a quiet wedding, of what they would do with her inheritance. "I want to transform St. Catherine's," Anne said, "so that no girl grows up believing she was born without worth." Alistair tightened his hand around hers. "Then we will do it together." When they parted that night, Anne returned to her room with a steady heart. She took the notebook where she had written down every lesson. On the final page she wrote, "Freedom is not only having choices, it is having the courage to make them," and she closed the notebook. Outside, Emberley Hall slept beneath a star-filled sky. The house that had once been a provisional shelter had become a permanent home, not because a duke had chosen her, but because she had chosen, freely. The girl forgotten in an orphanage had not been rescued. She had been recognized by herself. Epilogue, Emberley Hall, Spring 1826. Anne woke to golden light filtering through the silk curtains of the principal bedchamber. For a moment she lay still, listening to the comfortable silence of the house, the kind of silence that does not weigh upon you but shelters you. She turned and found the space beside her empty, though still warm. Alistair was already awake. She smiled to herself. Rising, she slipped into her robe and walked to the window. Below, the gardens of Emberley Hall stretched out, green, flowering, alive, unrecognizable compared to the cold, hostile landscape she had encountered a year earlier. A year. Long enough for a house to stop being a provisional refuge and become a home. Society had reacted exactly as they had expected. There had been whispers, closed doors, invitations never renewed. Lady Catherine had declared with offended gravity that certain boundaries had been irreversibly violated. But other doors had opened. Cautious visits followed, measuring glances, curious silences. And little by little, people discovered something they had not anticipated. A duchess who spoke of investments with clarity, of social reform with conviction, and who apologized for neither. Anne had learned too early that universal approval was an illusion. True happiness required less. The door opened behind her. "Good morning, Duchess." Anne turned, smiling. Alistair entered carrying a tray with tea and correspondence, a habit he stubbornly maintained despite Mrs. Keating's discreet objections about what was or was not appropriate for a duke. "Good morning, Duke," Anne replied, accepting the kiss he gave her without ceremony. He set the tray down and watched her for a moment, as he still did every morning, with that calm attentiveness that had never become routine. "The London plans have arrived," he said, handing her a thick envelope. "The architect believes St. Catherine's can double its capacity. The educational wing will be solid, filled with light, exactly as you envisioned." Anne spread the drawings across the table. Spacious rooms, a library, warm dormitories, gardens designed for children who would finally have space to run. "How much?" she asked, practical as ever. £1,000, Alistair replied. "Your inheritance covers everything, and the remaining income will ensure maintenance for decades." She closed her eyes for a brief moment. A year earlier, she had been invisible in that place. Now she was transforming it. "When do we begin?" she asked. "Next week," he said, smiling. "If the Duchess of Emberley approves." Anne laughed, pulling him closer. "The Duchess approves," she said, against his lips, "provided the Duke promises to walk beside her every step of the way." "Always," Alistair answered, without hesitation. They stood there, wrapped in the morning light, two strangers who had found each other at the precise intersection of duty and choice. "Edmund, he would be at peace," Alistair said at last. The name carried no weight, only acknowledgement. "I hope so," Anne replied, "because I will use the money he left out of fear to create courage in other girls." Alistair held her close, needing no reply. Outside, the gardens continued to bloom. And within Emberley Hall, the forgotten bastard and the Duke who chose to honour love remained there, no longer guardian and ward, no longer obligation and reparation. Just Anne and Alistair, husband and wife, equal partners, home. And when the work at St. Catherine's began, Anne would return to that place not as a painful memory, but as a fulfilled promise. Not as charity, but as justice. Proving that sometimes, just sometimes, stories of forgotten women do not end when someone saves them. They end when they save themselves first, and then freely choose who will walk beside them. And that, Anne knew, was the best story of all.